Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a quiet field where pale petals sway under the dim breath of dawn, and the air carries a faint, sweet scent that lingers like a forgotten story. The poppy waits there, patient and unassuming, its milky sap glimmering softly beneath the sun. In this stillness, we trace how something so delicate could ripple through centuries of healing and sorrow, shaping medicine and memory alike. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe, only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. Long before the modern hospital, before white coats and charts, before the word morphine ever existed, there was a plant with drooping petals and milky sap. People noticed it did something unusual when the petals fell and the green pod was sliced. A bead of thick amber liquid bled out, and when dried, it offered relief from pain and a strange, heavy calm. The poppy was both beautiful and slightly ominous. An ordinary garden flower that whispered its secrets to anyone desperate enough to listen. The earliest written records of this discovery go back to the ancient Sumerians, about 5,000 years ago, in what is now Iraq. Their tablets mention a plant of joy, which scholars later suspected meant the opium pop. The phrase feels optimistic, as if someone decided that pleasant numbness deserved an upbeat title. Across Mesopotamia, healers and priests blended crushed poppy with beer or wine, which probably made everything seem a bit better, at least for a little while. The mixture traveled slowly outward, one clay jar at a time, down rivers and across desert trails. By the time the Egyptians were building pyramids, opium had joined the catalogue of their medicinal world. The Ebers Papyrus, a vast medical scroll written around 1550 BCE, lists preparations that sound suspiciously narcotic, a little for cough, a little for sleeplessness, and a little, as one translation puts it, to stop crying in children. Historians usually pause here to sigh quietly. Giving babies opium was a bad idea even by ancient standards, but the world had not yet learned that lesson. Egypt's poppy products were traded along the Nile, shipped across the Mediterranean, and eventually found a welcoming audience among the Greeks. The Greek physician, Hippocrates, fond of logical explanations, thought opium should be used sparingly. Still, he acknowledged that it soothes pain and brings sleep. His successors, including Dioscorides and Galen, tried to systematize its use, classifying it according to its cooling and drying effects, because that was how ancient medicine measured almost everything. These early attempts to quantify comfort were admirable in a quaint way, half chemistry, half philosophy, entirely dependent on trial and error. As empires rose and collapsed, the poppy continued its quiet migration. Traders and conquerors carried seeds, not always intentionally. By the 1st century CE, Roman merchants were selling opium in small jars, and its price depended less on purity than on how desperate the buyer looked. In India, medical texts written in Sanskrit describe the poppy's virtues for cough and pain, listing it beside herbs and spices that were far less controversial. China, too, adopted it centuries later, folding it into traditional medicine as a modest ingredient in complex herbal formulas. For most of this long pre-modern era, opium existed as a trusted tool, not a menace. The real trouble began with precision. For thousands of years, people had brewed, chewed, or sipped the plant in its natural form. It was messy, variable, and surprisingly forgiving. Then chemistry arrived. In the late 18th century, Europe was buzzing with the new science of elements and compounds. Air and water had been dissected into invisible components, and natural philosophers were confident that everything else could be broken down to plants, with their mysterious fragrances and effects, were irresistible targets. In Germany, a young apothecary apprentice named Friedrich Saturner decided that opium must contain one special ingredient, the essence of its power. Working in a small shop, with improvised glassware and a patient streak of stubbornness, he soaked and filtered, crystallized and tasted, which sounds brave but was mostly reckless. Around 1804, he isolated a white crystalline powder that produced sleep and relief. So potent it seemed magical. He called it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was an elegant name, almost romantic, and it was the beginning of a global problem. Saturner didn't immediately spark an industrial revolution, but he set the pattern. Chemists all over Europe began extracting active compounds from plants, quinine from cinchona, caffeine from coffee beans, strychnine from tree seeds. Nature, it turned out, was full of complicated chemicals waiting to be purified and labeled. Morphium, soon called morphine in English, was the star of this new chemical stage. It offered the promise of pain relief without the mess of raw opium. Doctors loved it, patients loved it, and no one yet understood how love could turn into dependency. During the early 19th century, morphine appeared in elegant apothecary bottles with etched glass labels. It was expensive enough to be respectable, the kind of thing you might see in a physician's bag alongside a stethoscope and a notebook full of illegible handwriting. Dosage was guesswork. One pharmacist's milligram might be another's generous pinch. Still, the drug spread rapidly through European hospitals and colonial trading networks. The 1820s saw the rise of pharmaceutical firms, small family businesses that eventually grew into global names. Merck of Darmstadt was among the first to produce morphine commercially, transforming Saturner's discovery into a standardized product. As technology advanced, morphine's reach extended further. The 1850s introduced a sleek new gadget, the hypodermic syringe. Before that, opiates were swallowed or rubbed onto the skin, which limited their speed. The syringe changed everything. A few drops of morphine solution injected under the skin could calm agony almost instantly. For doctors, it was a miracle. For patients, a revelation. War ensured its fame. The Crimean War in the 1850s, and soon after, the American Civil War turned morphine into a battlefield essential. Surgeons could dull the pain of amputation, treat dysentery, quiet, feverish soldiers. It seemed humane, progressive, even noble, but large-scale relief came with large-scale consequences. When soldiers returned home, many carried not only scars but small vials of morphine and the habit of using them. The term soldier's disease appeared in medical writings to describe this new pattern of dependence. No one fully grasped the mechanism of addiction, but doctors could see its shape: tolerance, craving, withdrawal. They had invented a medical blessing that could not easily be unblessed. Still, morphine was legal, and society had a broad tolerance for self-medication. Victorian households stocked laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, as casually as modern homes keep painkillers in the bathroom. Writers, poets, and overworked clerks all swore by it. Thomas de Quincey published Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, describing his dreamlike dependence in sentences so elaborate that readers mistook his misery for glamour. By the 1870s, a typical pharmacy shelf might hold laudanum, morphine, cocaine wine, and various soothing syrups for children. All legal, all untaxed, all quietly addictive. The cultural mood was contradictory. opium and morphine were tools of progress, but they also lingered at the edge of moral unease. Clergymen warned about indulgence, while doctors argued over whether addiction was a sin or a side effect. The same society that built railways and telegraphs still viewed pain as a kind of moral test, and morphine was the cheat sheet. By the end of the 19th century, the problem had grown obvious enough to inspire new solutions, most of which were unfortunately worse. Chemists, never ones to leave well enough alone, began modifying the morphine molecule in hopes of making it safer. In 1874, an English researcher, C.R. Alder Wright, cooked up a compound by treating morphine with acetic anhydride. The result was diacetylmorphine, later named heroin. He noted its potency and promptly shelved it, probably realizing the world wasn't ready. A few decades later, chemists at the German company Bayer rediscovered it and marketed it as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. They even advertised it for children's coughs. The logic was, as it turned out, spectacularly wrong. As morphine and its offspring spread, governments finally began to stir. International conferences in the early 20th century debated opium trade restrictions, and the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in 1914, effectively criminalizing non-medical use. What had once been medicine was now a controlled substance. Yet demand didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. Pharmaceutical chemistry kept refining, standardizing, and naming. Each new compound was born under the promise of being safer than the last. Codeine, methadone, oxycodone, hydromorphone, all descended from the poppy's ancient sap. They populated hospitals, battlefields, and living rooms in alternating waves of relief and regret. Morphine itself remained the reference point, the gold standard of pain relief, and the cautionary tale that followed it like a shadow. Over 2 centuries, the poppy's gift became a mirror for humanity's mix of compassion and ambition. We wanted to end suffering, and we almost succeeded. The trouble was, we didn't know when to stop. It's hard to pinpoint where the story of morphine turns from discovery to warning. Maybe it was when the first soldier came home unable to sleep without his syringe. Maybe it was when a Victorian mother spooned laudanum into her baby's mouth and the house fell silent. Or maybe the turning point hasn't stopped turning. The 20th century would test every assumption about pain, progress, and chemical control. Morphine's descendants multiplied. Some were tamer, some far more dangerous, all bound by the same molecular core that Sir Turner had crystallized in his shop. The poppy's sap, now filtered through factories and policy debates, had become a global system. It would take science, politics, and a few uneasy miracles to keep up with it. As the 1900s opened, the optimism that once surrounded morphine began to dull. Doctors still prescribed it widely, but a new unease crept into the profession. Addiction had a clinical name now, and regulation hovered nearby. Morphine, that gentle tyrant of the 19th century, was about to meet its first wave of public backlash, a pattern that would repeat again and again in slightly different disguises. The early 20th century began with a polite illusion that governments could tidy up addiction with paperwork. In 1912, diplomats from several major powers met at The Hague to discuss what was delicately called the opium question. They signed an international convention that aimed to control production, but like most early regulations, it was an elegant promise without much follow-through. The poppy, meanwhile, kept blooming. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 took a bureaucratic approach rather than banning morphine outright. It required doctors, pharmacists, and manufacturers to register, record, and pay taxes on their transactions. On paper, it was a mild measure. In practice, it criminalized many forms of maintenance therapy. A physician could be punished for prescribing morphine to someone already dependent, even if that patient was trying to avoid withdrawal. The law did not remove addiction from society. It simply shifted it from the clinic to the street. Across Europe, morphine remained a common medical tool, especially in wartime. During World War I, morphine and its newer cousin heroin were standard issue in military medical kits. The scale of suffering was so vast that ethical debates about dependency seemed almost quaint. A soldier screaming from a shattered limb rarely cared about future cravings. The immediate need was silence, stillness, relief. In hospitals from the Western Front to the Ottoman deserts, syringes glinted under harsh light, and a strange quiet followed. After the war, a familiar pattern re-emerged. The armistice ended, but the habit lingered. Veterans, nurses, and doctors alike found themselves caught in the chemistry they had once wielded. Newspapers warned of the morphine peril. The phrase "dope fiend," coined in these years, reflected a mix of moral panic and social confusion. Addiction was treated as both a crime and a contagion, which is rarely a productive combination. Meanwhile, the drug industry evolved from family workshops to corporate laboratories. Standardization replaced guesswork. Glass ampoules and labeled bottles became the norm, promising purity and safety. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. Pure morphine was indeed reliable. It reliably caused dependence. Yet hospitals needed it, and so did patients. Cancer, trauma, and surgery all demanded pain control, and morphine remained the most effective answer. The 1920s and 1930s added new chemical relatives to the family tree. Codeine, derived from morphine but gentler in effect, became a popular ingredient in cough syrups and household tonics. It was the acceptable face of opiates, mild enough for advertising. The word soothing appeared on labels with the frequency of a nervous tick. Across the Atlantic, German chemists experimented with fully synthetic substitutes. One of them, methadone, would later become famous for an entirely different reason: maintenance therapy for opioid dependence. But in its infancy, it was simply another hopeful entry in the endless search for the perfect painkiller. The Second World War once again guaranteed demand. Armies stockpiled morphine in glass vials, stamped with military codes. Field medics carried them in small canvas pouches, each ampoule promising an island of calm amid chaos. Some veterans later recalled the peculiar relief of hearing a medic say, "Hold still," followed by the sting of the needle. For a moment, the world narrowed to a pulse and a warm drip. In the post-war years, medicine modernized at breakneck speed. Antibiotics cured infections that had once been fatal, and anesthesia turned major surgery into routine practice. Yet, even as medicine conquered new frontiers, pain management lagged behind moral caution. Doctors were taught to fear addiction more than suffering. Morphine was reserved for terminal cases, as if comfort itself required a death certificate. Pharmaceutical companies, sensing opportunity, began marketing improvements. One of these was oxycodone, first synthesized in Germany in 1916, but truly popularized decades later. It was smoother, they said, more refined. The public rarely noticed that its molecular structure looked suspiciously familiar, like morphine wearing a nicer suit. By mid-century, the world had entered what historians sometimes call the regulatory century. Nations signed more treaties, created control boards, and produced layers of paperwork that could sedate even the most enthusiastic smuggler. Yet beneath the bureaucracy, the same dual truth persisted. Opioids were both indispensable and dangerous. In hospitals, morphine brought grace to dying patients and sanity to surgeons. Outside, its derivatives seeped through illicit markets, sometimes smuggled in the same shipping lanes that carried legitimate medicine. In the United States, the 1950s and 60s brought the first wave of what would later be called the narcotics scare. Politicians framed addiction as a national security issue. The language grew dramatic: wars on drugs, plagues of dependency, and the nuance evaporated. Meanwhile, in laboratories, scientists kept adjusting the molecule. Fentanyl appeared in 1960, dazzlingly potent, meant for surgery and cancer pain. It was chemistry's equivalent of splitting the atom, useful, terrifying, and guaranteed to escape containment eventually. Methadone found a new purpose in the 1960s as researchers in New York tested it for treating heroin dependence. It worked, at least partially, by providing a stable, longer-acting opioid under medical supervision. Methadone allowed patients to step off the seesaw of withdrawal and relapse. It was a pragmatic solution, though not a sentimental one. Critics accused the program of merely substituting one drug for another. The doctors shrugged. Substitution was better than the morgue. During the late 20th century, morphine itself receded into the background, its name almost genteel compared to newer synthetics. It remained the standard for severe pain, the yardstick by which every new opioid was measured. Hospital charts spoke of morphine equivalents, as if the original molecule had quietly become a unit of suffering. In the developing world, it was still scarce, locked behind import regulations and pricing barriers. The same global system that once flooded markets with opium now managed to deny morphine to patients who genuinely needed it. By the 1980s, a shift was brewing. Pain advocacy groups argued that fear of addiction was causing unnecessary suffering. They used phrases like pain as the fifth vital sign. It sounded humane, and it was in theory, but it also opened the door for aggressive marketing. Pharmaceutical representatives arrived bearing glossy charts and complimentary pens, explaining that new formulations of oxycodone and hydrocodone were safe for chronic pain. Low risk of addiction, they promised, based on studies that were, charitably, optimistic. Doctors, eager to help their patients and pressured to show compassion, began prescribing with renewed confidence. Thus began the late century boom, a renaissance of opioid enthusiasm that looks suspiciously like amnesia. Morphine had been tamed, branded, extended, released, and insured. Patients with back pain, dental pain, post-surgical pain. Everyone seemed to qualify. Pharmacies became quiet nodes of a new network, one that would eventually unravel. If history had a sense of irony, this would have been the moment it smirked. The same civilization that once outlawed morphine to prevent addiction now manufactured morphine's descendants by the ton and encouraged their use under gentler names. The seeds of the next crisis were already sprouting, though no one wanted to water them. Prescription numbers rose, overdose deaths followed, and pharmaceutical companies continued to assure regulators that everything was under control. The pattern was almost mathematical. Pain relief expands, dependency follows, regulation tightens, black markets bloom, and the cycle begins again. Humanity, it seemed, could standardize almost anything except moderation. Still, there were bright corners. In palliative care, morphine remained what it had always been: mercy in a bottle. For terminal patients, The debates about addiction were irrelevant. Relief mattered more than abstinence. In that narrow, solemn corridor of medicine, the poppy fulfilled its oldest purpose without controversy. It eased departure. Outside that corridor, though, the world was sliding toward a reckoning. When morphine had first been isolated in 1804, it represented the triumph of science over suffering. 2 centuries later, it symbolized the uneasy truce between compassion and control. The molecule hadn't changed, only our stories about it had. And those stories were about to collide with reality in ways that even Friedrich Serturner could not have imagined. As the 20th century tipped into the 21st, pain management became both a business and a battleground. Advertising merged with medicine, regulation tangled with profit, and the quiet chemistry of the poppy once again became front-page news. By the 1990s, medicine had grown confident, maybe a little too confident. Hospitals gleamed, computers hummed, and pain was suddenly measurable. On a scale of 1 to 10, nurses asked, "How much does it hurt?" The idea seemed humane, even progressive, yet once pain became a number, it also became a target. Targets, as industries have a way of discovering, can be monetized. Pharmaceutical companies understood this perfectly. They began promoting newer opioids, not as last resorts for agony, but as everyday tools for ordinary discomfort, chronic back pain, joint pain, post-surgical soreness. Everything could be managed with a time-release tablet that promised steady relief. Oxycodone, hydrocodone, and their extended-release versions were presented as modern miracles, sophisticated, safe, almost domestic. A small capsule could dissolve 12 hours of pain. What could possibly go wrong? The marketing was relentless, but soothing. Sales representatives visited doctors' offices with sandwiches and slideshows. They cited studies, tiny, short-term, and quietly funded, that suggested addiction was rare among patients who genuinely suffered pain. The message spread through medical conferences and glossy journal ads. Opioids were misunderstood, and compassionate care meant using them without shame. Doctors, trained to relieve suffering, found this argument appealing. Nobody likes to feel like the villain of their own profession. Prescriptions rose sharply through the 1990s. Pharmacies filled them, insurers reimbursed them, and patients felt relief, at least for a while. Then tolerance crept in. The body, ever adaptive, began demanding a little more to achieve the same effect. Doctors taught that pain must be controlled. Increased doses. The cycle turned quietly behind suburban doors and rural clinics alike. By the early 2000s, whole regions were awash in opioid pills. Some towns in Appalachia and the Midwest received more prescriptions than they had residents. The supply chain was legal, its paperwork immaculate. Warehouses, distributors, and pharmacies all met their quotas. On spreadsheets, it looked like prosperity. In homes, it looked like chaos. People who could no longer afford their prescriptions turned to cheaper alternatives. Street pills, then heroin. Dealers understood the market better than regulators did. When pills became expensive, heroin filled the gap, and when heroin's potency varied, illicit chemists began cutting it with something stronger and easier to smuggle. Fentanyl, a few milligrams too much, and the line between high and fatal blurred into nothing. Meanwhile, lawsuits began to pile up. Journalists unearthed internal memos showing that drug companies knew their products were addictive long before they admitted it. Executives insisted the problem was abuse, a word that sounded tidy and individual. It implied that molecules were innocent and people were not. The public conversation tilted toward morality again, addicts as sinners rather than casualties of policy. It was a familiar melody, one the world had hummed since the 19th century. Government responses followed the old rhythm: first denial, then outrage, then legislation. Prescription monitoring programs were rolled out, making it harder for patients to collect multiple prescriptions. Doctors grew cautious, then fearful, cutting patients off abruptly. Some of those patients, desperate and dependent, turned to the street supply, which by now was thick with fentanyl analogs. The crackdown, though well-intentioned, sometimes traded one crisis for another. The numbers grew grim. By the mid-2010s, tens of thousands of Americans were dying annually from opioid overdoses. The epidemic no longer looked like a fringe issue. It looked like a mirror. Families across economic and political lines found themselves touched by the same quiet devastation. In rural towns, churches held weekly vigils. In cities, morgues overflowed. The federal government declared a public health emergency, and researchers began speaking of waves of the opioid crisis, the first driven by prescriptions, the second by heroin, the third by synthetic fentanyl. It was a grim ocean, and the tide kept coming, yet the poppy's old duality remained. In hospitals, morphine continued to ease the pain of surgery and cancer. In hospice wards, it softened the boundary between life and death. For every misuse headline, there were thousands of quiet moments in which the same chemical restored dignity or sleep. It was difficult to hate a molecule that had done so much good. It was also difficult to forgive it. Medical education began to shift again. Younger doctors were taught to balance compassion with caution. They learned about multimodal pain management, non-opioid medications, physical therapy, mindfulness, even acupuncture. Some of these worked, some merely filled the silence. The pendulum had swung from overuse to underuse, and patients caught in chronic pain sometimes felt abandoned. It was a difficult equilibrium. Society wanted to prevent addiction, but also avoid cruelty. There were no easy formulas. Meanwhile, the legal battles intensified. Major drug companies faced billions in settlements, accused of deceptive marketing and reckless distribution. Internal documents read like tragic comedies of corporate optimism. Phrases such as "maximize sales territories" appeared beside statistics showing rising overdose deaths. Shareholders demanded growth. Regulators demanded restraint. The two demands, as usual, were incompatible. Amid the lawsuits and legislative hearings, researchers returned to basics. How exactly did morphine and its cousins manipulate the brain? They mapped receptor sites, traced neural pathways, and catalogued the body's natural opioids, endorphins, that flicker briefly during stress or exercise. Morphine, it turned out, was simply better at its job than nature had planned. It locked into the same receptors, but refused to leave, lingering like an uninvited guest at a polite party. That persistence explained both its power and its peril. By the 2020s, fentanyl dominated the headlines. It was so potent that a few grains could replace an entire bag of heroin. Dealers mixed it into counterfeit pills, sometimes without knowing the dosage themselves. Overdose prevention programs scrambled to distribute naloxone, the reversal drug that could snatch a person back from respiratory collapse if used quickly enough. Police officers carried it, librarians carried it, sometimes even bus drivers did. The act of saving lives became part of everyday civic duty. Public discourse began to soften again, edging toward empathy. Addiction was increasingly framed as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. Treatment centers expanded, offering medications such as methadone and buprenorphine to stabilize patients. These programs, once controversial, became mainstream, supported by data showing they reduced deaths dramatically. The stigma, however, moved slower than science. Families still whispered about problems rather than illnesses. Politicians still spoke of fighting drugs, as if chemistry could be conquered like an army. Yet beneath the rhetoric, something had shifted. Communities began adopting harm reduction strategies, needle exchanges, supervised consumption sites, and widespread naloxone access. These efforts did not end addiction, but they kept people alive long enough to recover, which in public health terms counts as success. The moral tone of the conversation cooled slightly. Survival had become its own form of progress. Through it all, morphine itself remained unchanged. A century after its isolation, it was still the benchmark for pain relief. In hospitals, doctors prescribed it with careful math and faint reverence. In lectures, they called it both a gift and a warning. The molecule seemed almost weary, as if it had lived too many lives. Sacred plant, battlefield miracle, household tonic, controlled substance, and now historical scapegoat. If the poppy could speak, it might sigh. Humanity had spent thousands of years oscillating between gratitude and regret. Each generation rediscovered the same truth, that pain demands relief, and relief always asks a price. Morphine merely made that exchange visible. By the late 2020s, the public began asking what came next. Could science invent a pain payer without dependence? Researchers explored biased agonists, molecules that activated pain relief pathways, but avoided the euphoric circuits linked to addiction. Early trials were promising, then disappointing, as biology reminded everyone that evolution is stubborn. The brain's reward system cannot easily be tricked. Pleasure and pain share too many doors. Still, progress continued in smaller ways. Better guidelines, improved monitoring, and patient education began to stabilize prescription trends. Overdose deaths remained high, but plateaued in some regions. The war on drugs slowly turned into a public health campaign, less dramatic, but more sustainable. In the quiet rooms of hospices, morphine still performed its ancient role, a thread connecting millennia of human need. What began as the plant of joy in ancient Sumeria had become a mirror for modern civilization. It reflected our empathy, our impatience, our commerce, and our confusion. The poppy had never forced anyone's hand. It merely offered a bargain. We kept accepting it, hoping this time to pay less. The story was not over, of course. Medicine rarely ends. It only drifts. New compounds, new crises, and new debates would follow, all tracing their ancestry back to that small, milky bead of sap oozing from a wounded flower. Humanity had built empires on stranger things. As the century drifted forward, morphine took on an almost mythic reputation, both savior and saboteur, depending on who told the story. Doctors still referred to it as the gold standard of pain management, the measuring stick for every new analgesic that came along. Yet even those who relied on it spoke the name carefully, as if invoking a moody ancestor who might show up uninvited. Hospitals, with their steady rhythm of beeps and footsteps, became the modern temples where morphine performed its ritual. Post-surgical wards ran on its precision, a measured dose, a monitored pulse, a temporary release from the body's complaints. The drug itself was neither villain nor hero. It simply did what it always had: dulled pain and quieted panic. Nurses referred to it with weary affection, like an unpredictable co-worker. They knew its moods: the soft drift in a patient's face, the slowed breathing that made everyone glance at the monitors a little too often. In hospice care, morphine's reputation softened further. There, its effect was not measured in milligrams, but in moments of peace. Families watched as loved ones exhaled their pain into the still air of late evening, the drug blurring sharp edges of suffering until only calm remained. In these rooms, moral debates outside seemed distant and abstract. Relief was relief, and the clock was already running out. Yet, in the world beyond hospital walls, the moral pendulum continued to swing. One decade's compassion became the next decade's crisis. Pharmaceutical executives testified before Congress with expressions of deep regret. Politicians promised task forces, committees, and initiatives. None of it changed the simple truth that humans had a complicated relationship with feeling good. The irony was ancient. Even in classical Greece, writers warned of the poppy's double edge. The same sap that soothed pain also tempted overuse. The ancients, lacking the language of receptors and neurochemistry, still grasped the idea of dependence. They described it as a kind of forgetfulness, a slipping away from ordinary life. Thousands of years later, we just renamed the forgetting. By the mid-2030s, assuming the trend lines hold, medicine may finally have something approaching balance. Prescription oversight became digital. Algorithms scanning for red flags. Artificial intelligence sorted patient data into careful categories: legitimate need, probable misuse, likely diversion. The machines, for all their precision, lacked empathy, but also lacked bias. They treated every prescription as a math problem, and perhaps that was safer. Still, even the best algorithm could not feel a person's pain or watch the way their face tightened when they moved. Doctors learned to use data as a guardrail, not a leash. The paradox of morphine persisted. It was essential yet dangerous, ordinary yet taboo. The same culture that banned its recreational cousins continued to depend on it for surgeries, childbirth, and emergencies. Every ambulance carried it. Every hospital stocked it. Every medical student practiced with its dosage charts. Morphine had achieved something few inventions ever do. It became both timeless and controversial at once. In classrooms, medical historians began using morphine as a case study in unintended consequences. Students read about Frederick Serturner, that earnest apothecary who first isolated it in 1804, and wondered if he understood what he'd set in motion. He probably didn't. Discovery always feels clean at first, an act of clarity, not contamination. The consequences take their time. The story also became a mirror for industrial modernity. Morphine, after all, was the first alkaloid ever extracted from a plant. The birth of pharmaceutical chemistry itself. From that single act of isolation came quinine, caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, atropine, an entire lexicon of laboratory miracles and disasters. Morphine was both the ancestor of modern medicine and the prototype of its moral dilemmas. If the poppy had a sense of humor, it might appreciate this evolution. Once it grew wild in the hills of Anatolia and the valleys of Mesopotamia, its latex collected by farmers who probably didn't think of chemistry at all. Now its descendants were synthesized in sterile factories under fluorescent light, measured in micrograms and recorded in databases. The flower's essence had gone digital, yet, despite all the progress, the human experience of pain remained almost the same. A broken bone still throbbed. A grieving heart still ached. The tools had changed, but the sensations hadn't. Morphine's quiet whisper through the nervous system continued to be the simplest conversation between chemistry and suffering. Some philosophers of medicine argued that morphine revealed the limits of science's moral imagination. We could describe pain, measure it, and dampen it, but we could not decide what it meant. Pain was once considered divine punishment, then a biological glitch, then a social inconvenience. Each redefinition brought new treatments, new markets, and new forms of guilt. Morphine did not solve the problem of pain. It merely made it bearable enough for people to keep thinking about it. The opioid crisis of the early 21st century, for all its tragedy, did spark genuine innovation. Scientists developed non-opioid analgesics targeting entirely different pathways, ion channels, inflammatory cascades, and even genetic switches that altered pain perception. Some of these new drugs worked well, others fizzled. None achieved morphine's strange balance of simplicity and power. Every alternative seemed either weaker or more complicated. The molecule still held its crown. Meanwhile, global health organizations pushed for equitable access to morphine in countries where it remained scarce. In large parts of Africa and South Asia, patients with terminal cancer or severe injuries still endured agony without relief because of restrictive laws and supply bottlenecks. The same well that once overflowed with opioids in rich nations hoarded them away from the poor. It was, in bureaucratic language, a distributional paradox. In moral language, it was simply cruel. Efforts to fix that imbalance began slowly. The World Health Organization included morphine on its essential medicines list, a modest but symbolic gesture. Some countries reformed their import systems, allowing small quantities of oral morphine for palliative care. In those places, a nurse's visit with a paper cup of bitter solution could transform an entire household. Pain, when eased, changed not only the patient but everyone around them. The world, for a few hours, became gentler. In the West, technology redefined the drug. Yet again, researchers developed programmable pumps that delivered microdoses directly into the spinal fluid, minimizing side effects and reducing risk. The interface looked almost like science fiction. A small device under the skin, a remote control calibrated to comfort. Patients could sleep without fear of overdose, and doctors could monitor usage in real time. Morphine had finally become a controlled whisper instead of a shout. Still, dependency lingered as an uneasy companion. Even at therapeutic levels, long-term users develop tolerance. The body adjusts, as bodies do, insisting on equilibrium. A patient who had needed 5 milligrams a day might require 10, then 15. At some point, the balance tips. Managing that threshold became the central art of pain medicine. Enough relief to live, not so much that living becomes impossible without it. The cultural conversation surrounding morphine mellowed over time. Fewer people spoke of war on drugs, more spoke of stewardship. The new rhetoric favored care and caution over confrontation. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Harm reduction programs expanded. Overdose deaths in some areas declined. For once, the data suggested humanity might be learning something slowly, unevenly, but genuinely. Yet, the story was still haunted by history. Every progress report, every reform, carried an echo of past optimism. This time we'll get it right, people said, the same way they'd said it in 1804, in 1853, in 1898, in 1996. The cycle was almost comforting in its predictability. Perhaps the poppy had become a metaphor not for pain or pleasure, but for human repetition. We keep discovering the same lessons, only to forget them when relief feels too good. In the quiet hours of the modern hospital, morphine continued its steady work. A patient drifted into sleep. A monitor ticked softly. Outside, the city hummed in electric blue. The molecule, indifferent to headlines and history, flowed through bloodstreams as it always had, turning pain into distance, grief into breath, and fear into silence. The world might argue endlessly about ethics, but the body, ever practical, knew only gratitude. And so the paradox endured. Morphine was both the triumph of science and its humbling reminder, proof that mastery and mercy can look nearly identical under the right light. A flower had taught us chemistry, compassion, and consequence, all in the same slow lesson, and even now, after centuries of use and misuse, it continued to whisper the same faint suggestion to anyone listening. Relief is never free, but it is still relief. The longer morphine's story stretched, the more it seemed to resemble a mirror rather than a timeline. Each generation looked into it and saw its own reflection, hopeful, frightened, ambitious, or ashamed. The molecule didn't change, only the faces did. By the middle of the 21st century, it had become almost mythological, the kind of chemical that philosophers could use as shorthand for everything complicated about being human. Medical schools continued to teach its chemistry, its receptor binding, its side effects, all of it in tidy bullet points on glowing lecture slides. But in between those details was an unspoken lesson. Morphine was not merely a drug, it was a story about intention colliding with consequence. Young doctors, hearing about its invention and its disasters, tended to nod solemnly, as if they might be the first generation to avoid repeating history. They would not be, of course, but hope, like pain, is stubborn. The global conversation around opioids settled into a kind of weary equilibrium. The panic of the early 2000s had ebbed, replaced by realism. People understood now that addiction was a disease, not a moral collapse, and that banning a substance rarely erased its demand. In most developed nations, treatment replaced punishment as the dominant policy. Methadone and buprenorphine clinics multiplied, quietly and efficiently, tucked between grocery stores and bus stops. Patients arrived not in shame, but in routine. People managing a chronic condition, not fugitives. Meanwhile, palliative care programs spread across the world. In places once defined by scarcity, morphine tablets appeared for the first time. A village clinic in Kenya, a hospice in India, a hospital in rural Peru. Each became a small proof that compassion could travel as easily as commerce, if someone insisted on it. The medicine that had caused so much harm in one hemisphere finally brought mercy to another. History, for once, seemed to balance its own scales. Even so, the moral undertones never fully disappeared. Some governments hesitated to expand access, haunted by visions of Western addiction. Others imposed strict quotas that left dying patients rationing their comfort like contraband. Fear, it seemed, was more contagious than empathy. The poppy's shadow reached far beyond pharmacology. It touched bureaucracy, religion, and law. In the richer nations, another transformation was underway. Artificial intelligence, that latecomer to every profession, began to shape pain management. Algorithms monitored hospital inventories and patient responses, predicting tolerance before it appeared. They recommended dose adjustments with clinical detachment. Some doctors loved the precision, others missed the guesswork that felt more human. The machines didn't second-guess themselves, which was both comforting and eerie. Pain, reduced to data points, risked to losing its moral weight, yet the patient experience remained timeless. On a hospital bed or in a home hospice, pain still felt personal, still demanded trust. Morphine still worked the way it always had, binding to receptors, dulling signals, creating a soft space between agony and awareness. The oldest pharmacology in the world was still the most reliable. Historians began writing about morphine as a lens for understanding modernity. Its arc from sacred poppy to synthetic fentanyl traced the rise of chemistry, capitalism, and regulation all at once. It was a chemical biography of civilization's contradictions, the same ingenuity that built antibiotics and vaccines had also mass-produced addiction. The same humanitarian desire to ease suffering had built entire industries on dependency. The poppy's sap was the world's oldest moral riddle. Some writers compared morphine to fire, discovered early, essential, and forever dangerous. It could cook, it could comfort, it could destroy. The comparison fit a little too neatly, perhaps, but it captured the essence of the dilemma. Humanity never gives up its tools. It just keeps learning to hold them differently. Even pop culture began to shift its tone. Earlier depictions of junkies as villains or outcasts faded, replaced by more humane portrayals. People struggling under chemistry, not consumed by sin. Television dramas showed addiction counselors instead of police chasers. Documentaries followed patients tapering doses, not criminals smuggling powder. The cultural script was slowly rewriting itself. In this gentler narrative, morphine was not an enemy, but a complicated ally, a reminder that compassion requires constant maintenance. The real antagonist, perhaps, was the illusion of control, the belief that a perfect drug could exist, that suffering could be erased without residue. History had already disproved that fantasy many times over. The scientific frontier moved on. Of course, laboratories explored genetic therapies to alter pain perception itself. Researchers studied the brain's natural opioids, hoping to mimic their precision without their baggage. Some even speculated about future implants that could toggle pain like a dimmer switch, regulated by neural feedback. It all sounded promising, in the same way that every new solution had sounded promising since 1804. Somewhere, Friedrich Serturner might have smiled faintly, but chemistry kept evolving. But the craving for relief, for control, for comfort, stayed perfectly constant. In quieter corners of academia, ethicists debated whether humanity had learned the right lesson. Was the goal to abolish pain entirely, or to coexist with it more wisely? Pain, after all, had evolutionary value. It kept bodies safe, warned against harm, anchored people in the present. Morphine's triumph was that it silenced those alarms, but perhaps too thoroughly. Some philosophers suggested that a world without pain would also lack empathy. The rest of us, not philosophers, just wanted to sleep through the night. By now, the global supply chain for opioids had become one of the most tightly regulated systems on Earth. From poppy field to pharmacy shelf, every gram was tracked. Illicit markets still existed, of course, they always do. But the scale had changed. Street fentanyl was the new terror. While legitimate morphine lived in sterile isolation, its use confined mostly to hospitals and palliative wards. The chaos of the early 21st century had hardened into a cautious routine. Every so often, a historian would publish a sweeping account of the opioid era, giving it neat chapter headings and moral conclusions. But the story refused to end. Morphine remained in the bloodstream of civilization, too useful to discard, too powerful to forget. It had outlived empires, ideologies, and at least 3 international control regimes. A humble alkaloid had become one of the most enduring companions of human suffering. In its own strange way, that endurance was comforting. It meant that progress, for all its errors, was not entirely blind. We kept returning to the same chemical not because we were foolish, but because it worked. Pain is stubborn, and so is the desire to ease it. Between those 2 constants, morphine continued to hum quietly, neither cure nor curse, just chemistry fulfilling its purpose. The long shadow it cast over history wasn't entirely dark. It stretched, instead, like evening lights, soft, inevitable, and oddly beautiful in its persistence. From the clay tablets of Sumer to the digital dashboards of modern medicine, humanity had been tracing the same pattern. Suffering, discovery, relief, regret, adjustment, and then inevitably, gratitude. Each age added another layer of reflection, another attempt to reconcile compassion with control. Some future generation may finally master the balance. Or maybe they'll invent another molecule and start the cycle again. Either way, the poppy will still bloom somewhere, small and unassuming, its pods swelling quietly under the sun, waiting for someone to make the next deliberate cut. The poppy has never cared much for human history. It grows wherever the soil suits it. Gentle hillsides, forgotten fields, roadside edges, and lets people decide whether it's a blessing or a curse. Long after empires crumble, the plant keeps its routine sprout, flower, bleed, sleep. Somewhere in that quiet cycle lies the whole story of morphine, though we tend to make it louder than it needs to be. By the 21st century's middle decades, the world had developed a wary truce with the poppy's gift. In hospitals, morphine occupied its familiar place, efficient and humble. In classrooms, it was a cautionary tale. In public memory, it had become something close to a myth, half science, half morality play. Everyone knew its name, even those who'd never seen a vial of it. It lived in the language now, shorthand for both comfort and caution. A morphine moment, people said, meaning a relief that might cost too much later. The plant's ancient history had become almost poetic in hindsight. Archaeologists unearthed opium jugs in Cyprus, their handles shaped like poppy pods, evidence that 5,000 years ago someone had already learned how to scrape dry and dream. Each discovery made modern scientists look less like inventors and more like heirs. The chemistry was new, the impulse wasn't. We've always searched for silence in the body, a pause button on suffering. As the global opioid crisis receded from its worst years, humanity entered what one commentator called the reflective phase. That was a polite way of saying we were counting our losses. Millions of lives touched or ended by dependence. Countless families rearranged around absence. It wasn't the kind of reckoning that produced clear villains or heroes. The molecules didn't care. The markets did what markets do, and people caught in the middle tried to cope. Governments eventually formalized their apologies through policy funding for treatment, education, and research. Universities established centers for pain and addiction studies, pairing neuroscientists with sociologists and historians. It turned out the chemistry of suffering was only half the problem. The other half lived in loneliness, despair, and poverty, the usual human ingredients that no prescription could fully erase. Morphine had never promised to fix those, we just kept pretending it might. Yet, amid the bureaucracy of regret, real progress unfolded quietly. Communities built networks of care that blurred the old line between medicine and compassion. Local pharmacies stocked naloxone beside aspirin. Schools taught basic overdose response. Along with CPR, cities installed vending machines that dispensed sterile syringes, a small, unceremonious miracle of harm reduction. Somewhere, Friedrich Serturner's ghost might have approved of the practicality, if not the method. In the developing world, morphine's story followed a different rhythm. After decades of scarcity, access programs began to see. Nurses in Uganda or Nepal could administer oral morphine without fear of arrest. Families learned that easing a loved one's pain was not a crime, but an act of dignity. The global imbalance started to even out, though slowly, as if the poppy's justice preferred to move at the pace of growing things. Back in the laboratories, researchers worked on synthetic pathways that no longer required the plant at all. Yeast engineered to produce opiates in bioreactors offered precision without poppy fields. The irony was almost comic. 5 millennia of cultivation, replaced by microbes in stainless steel vats. Humanity had finally domesticated the chemistry, but not the craving. That craving, paradoxically, kept medicine alive. Without pain, there would be no healing, no empathy, no reason for all this effort. Morphine's endurance proved less about addiction than about connection. Every doctor who reached for a syringe, every nurse who adjusted a dose, every patient who exhaled in relief, they were all participating in an ancient exchange, as old as agriculture and just as complicated. The debates never really ended. Some argued for total abolition, others for radical compassion. Both sides spoke from experience. Both were partly right. The real world, inconveniently, required compromise. Morphine survived not because it was flawless, but because it worked just well enough to forgive its flaws. Medicine, like history, runs on those kinds of bargains. In the cultural imagination, the poppy settled into a kind of uneasy peace. Painkillers became less glamorous, more mechanical. Patches, pumps, timed release capsules. The old romantic haze around opiates faded, replaced by sober pragmatism. Even literature grew quieter about them, gone were the tortured poets clutching bottles of laudanum. In their place stood clinical memoirs, measured and sad, describing addiction in the language of recovery. And yet, under the surface, the same question lingered. Why do we keep returning to the poppy? Maybe because it represents the simplest form of human hope, the wish that suffering can be negotiated, not erased, just softened. Morphine, in its unassuming chemical certainty, has always granted that wish, and then gently demanded payment later. Future generations will likely inherit both its utility and its caution labels. They may create new drugs that bypass its pitfalls, or perhaps they'll circle back to it again, as they always do. Every few decades, someone rediscovers the balance between mercy and restraint and proclaims it new. Then the pattern resets. Pain, after all, is infinite, so is our impatience with it. What remains remarkable is how much goodness has persisted in the shadow of all that harm. Morphine has eased more pain than any substance in history. It has comforted the dying, steadied the wounded, and granted millions a few hours of bearable existence. For every overdose, there were countless quiet recoveries. For every scandal, there were lives made livable. History rarely measures mercy in statistics, but perhaps it should. In the end, the story of morphine is less about chemistry than about endurance. A flower in a field, scientist in a workshop, a nurse by a bedside, all linked by one fragile idea. that relief is worth the risk of imperfection. Humanity has built entire systems, laws, and economies around that idea. We keep revising it, refining it, apologizing for it, but never abandoning it. Some nights, when hospital corridors grow still and the lights dim to the color of sleep, morphine continues its silent work. A patient's breathing evens out, a monitor softens its rhythm, and for a few minutes the world forgets its pain. The same molecule that once fueled wars and epidemics becomes again just comfort in a vein. The poppy's whisper returns to its original purpose, quiet, fleeting mercy. And perhaps that is how it will always be. The sacred plant, the battlefield miracle, the household remedy, the regulated substance, each version only a chapter in the same long lullaby. Morphine's legacy is not just about addiction or medicine, but about the uneasy grace of being human. We hurt, we heal, we forget, we repeat, and somewhere in between, the poppy blooms again, modest and untroubled, carrying its secret as it always has.